Persuade to reason, but mankind were at liberty, after all, whether to take their advice or not. And this shows the necessity of supernatural revelation, not merely to make known things beyond human apprehension, but to enforce with proper authority such duties as might be discovered by man, since without it they would not have the binding force of a law. As to the sanction of rewards and punishments in Christianity, they are such as became a God to annex to his majestic law, such as are agreeable to creatures formed for immortality, and such as would have the most effectual tendency to encourage obedience and prevent sin. They are no less than the most perfect happiness and misery which human nature is capable of, and that through an endless duration. If these are not sufficient to allure rational creatures to obedience, then no considerations that can be proposed can have any effect. These tend to alarm our hopes and our fears, the most vigorous springs of human activity. And if these have no effect upon us, nothing that God can reveal or our minds conceive will have any effect. God, by adding the greatest sanctions possible to his law, has taken the best possible precautions to prevent disobedience. And since even these do not restrain men from it, we are sure that less would not suffice. If men will go on and sin, though they believe the punishment due it will be eternal, then much more would they persist in it if it were not eternal. Or, if they say they will indulge themselves in sin because they believe it not eternal, then this proves from their own mouth that it should be eternal in order to restrain them. The prevalence of sin in the world tends to render it miserable, and therefore to prevent it, as well as to display God's eternal regard to moral goodness, it is fit that he should annex the highest degree of punishment to disobedience in every individual. For the indulgence of sin in one individual would be a temptation to the whole rational creation. And on the other hand, the threatenings of everlasting punishment to all sinners indefinitely is necessary to deter the whole rational world and every particular person from disobedience. Thus, in civil government, it is necessary that robbery should be threatened indefinitely with death, because though one robber may take from a man but what he can very well spare, yet if every man might rob and plunder his neighbor, the consequence would be universal robbery and confusion. It is therefore necessary that the greatest punishment should be threatened to disobedience, both to prevent it and to testify the divine displeasure against it, which is the primary design of the threatening. And since the penalty was annexed with this view, it follows that it was primarily enacted with a view to the happiness of mankind, by preventing what would naturally make them miserable, and but secondarily with a view to be executed. For it is to be executed only upon condition of disobedience, which disobedience it was intended to prevent, and consequently it was not immediately intended to be executed or enacted for the sake of the execution, as though God took a malignant pleasure in the misery of his creatures. But when the penalty has failed of its primary end, restraining from sin, then it is fit it should answer its secondary end and be executed upon the offender, to keep the rest of reasonable creatures in their obedience, to illustrate the veracity and holiness of the lawgiver, and prevent his government from falling into contempt. There are the same reasons that threatenings should be executed when denounced as for their being denounced at first, for threatenings never executed are the same with no threatenings at all. Let me add that the gospel lays under us the strongest obligations from gratitude. It not only clearly informs us of our obligations to God, as the author of our being and all our temporal blessings, which natural religion more faintly discovers, but superadds those more endearing ones derived from the scheme of man's redemption through the death of the eternal Son of God. Through the blessings of creation and providence, though the blessings of creation and providence are great in themselves, they are swallowed up, as it were, and lost in the love of God, which is commanded to us by this matchless circumstance, that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. And while under the constraints of his love, we cannot but devote ourselves entirely to God. 2 Corinthians 5:14 and 15. Thus I have hinted at a few things among the many that might be mentioned to prove the divinity of the religion of Jesus and its sufficiency to bring men to repentance and salvation. And if it be so, why should it be rejected or another sought? This reminds me that I promised, and we will continue next time with this, to expose the vanity and unreasonableness of the objection against the Christian religion or of demanding another, etc.